one slide change.
Yes, only one slide, and then you go back to the cover page.
Do you want me to go
back?
back?
Yeah, back. Is that possible? Unless that's a problem for you.
There's no back.
Oui. Can you take it away? Yes. So you go, but then, and then you do that, and you go back to the beginning. Yes, just one slide. But then you go back to the beginning, the general backdrop, or this. Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Yes, I will. Okay. Well, welcome back to the next part of our conference. Delighted that we have Michel Barnier to talk about how the future of Europe looks from his perspective as the head of the Brexit task force. His remarks, of course, are on the record, and to remind you, this conference is being streamed on the Centre for European Reform. Inviting me today. It's very good to see that this UK-based centre, it's okay? With a Brussels office. Is stepping up its presence in Brussels. Good timing. It feels a bit unusual to speak about Brexit here, because this is a conference on the future of the EU. And Brexit is about disentangling the UK from the EU and settling the past. But Brexit could prove to be a turning point in the European project. And for future historians, the year 2016, with the UK referendum, the change of power in Washington, if I may say, geopolitical tensions, terrorist attacks, and the rise of populist parties will perhaps be seen as a time of awakening. 2016 could become the moment where the EU realized that it had to stand up for itself and that nobody would do for us, nobody, what we don't do for ourselves. To prove this point, let me use this slide, if I may. This slide has a very particular history. In 2012, the UK Prime Minister published this table to show his strong support of the single market and incidentally his support of the commissioner in charge of the single market, I suppose. It shows that in 2050, which is not too far, there will be no European countries left in the G8. It shows also that by remaining together, the 27 will stay in the long term in the top 5. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to continue speaking with one voice in the world, even though we speak many different languages, as the novelist Fernando Pessoa said. Otherwise, we will not sit at the table where decisions are made. I suppose at this table, Charles, don't need further comments. Huh? No. We need to act, ladies and gentlemen, together to build a stronger Europe. The Eurozone needs a more complete banking union and a fiscal capacity with a finance minister. The EU needs a more integrated capital markets union. Such increased risk-sharing needs, common rules, and common enforcement. The EU needs a stronger capacity to prevent and tackle internal and external threats, with stronger cooperation in fighting terrorism, but also with respect for fundamental rights. The EU needs a truly common foreign policy and European defense. The EU needs to lead on global challenges, from climate change to openness in trade, based on its social market economy. And it needs to continue leading in global financial regulation to make finance work for the real economy. And we need more solidarity in our union with a humane and efficient migration policy and a strong pillar of social rights, as agreed last Friday in Gothenburg. This stronger European Union will want to have a close relationship with the UK. We have a shared history, and this history started long before the last 44 years. That is why the no deal is not our scenario, even though we will be ready for it. I regret that this no-deal option comes up so often in the UK public debate. Only those who ignore or want to ignore the current benefits of European Union membership can say that no deal would be a positive result. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 3 keys to building a strong partnership with the UK. 3 keys. First, we need to agree on the terms for the UK's orderly withdrawal. The 27 member states and the European Parliament have been always very clear on what it means. And we have been consistent. Our priority on settling the accounts accurately, we owe this to taxpayers as well as to all those benefiting from EU funding projects in the UK and in the EU. And also very clear on Ireland. Let me Ireland specifically. We need to preserve stability and dialogue on the island of Ireland. We need to avoid a hard border. I know that this point is politically sensitive in the UK. It is not less sensitive in Ireland. Some in the UK say that specific rules for Northern Ireland would endanger the integrity of the UK single market. But Northern Ireland already, ladies and gentlemen, has specific rules in many areas that are different to the rest of the UK. Think of the whole island electricity market, or of the specific regulation for plant health for the whole island of Ireland. Think of rules that prevent and handle animal disease, which I know quite well as a former Minister for Agriculture. There are over 100 areas of cross-border cooperation on the island of Ireland. And such cooperations depends in many cases, on the application of common rules and common regulatory space. We have nearly finished our common reading of the Good Friday Agreement. We have agreed on the principle for the common travel area. The UK and the EU have recognized that Ireland poses specific challenges and that the unique circumstances there require a specific solution. On the EU side, we must preserve, obviously, the integrity of the single market and the custom unions at 27. The rules for this are clear. The UK said it will continue to apply some EU rules on its territory, but not all rules. What is therefore unclear is what rules will apply in Northern Ireland after Brexit, and what the UK is willing to commit to avoid a hard border. I expect the UK as co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement to come forward with proposals. The island of Ireland is now faced with many challenges. Those who wanted Brexit must offer solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, the second key is the integrity of the single market. The public debate on what leaving the EU means needs to be intensified everywhere, not only in the UK. There are, in fact, two contradicting sound bites from ardent advocates of Brexit. The UK will finally set itself free from EU regulations and bureaucracy, some claim. Others claim that after Brexit, it will still be possible to participate in parts of the single market, simply because we have been together for more than 4 decades with the same rules, and that we can continue to trust each other. Ladies and gentlemen, none of these views seems to offer a sound basis for going forward. None. The same people who argue for setting the UK free also argue that the UK should remain in some EU agencies. But freedom implies responsibility for building new UK administrative capacity. And on our side, the 27 will continue to deepen the work of those agencies together. They will share the costs for running those agencies. Our businesses will benefit from their expertise. All of their work is firmly based on the EU treaties, which the UK decided to leave. Those who claim that the UK should cherry-pick parts of the single market must stop this contradiction. The single market is a package with 4 indivisible freedoms, common rules, institutions, and enforcement structures. The UK knows these rules very well, like the back of its hand. It has contributed to defining them over the last 44 years with a certain degree of influence. We took note of the UK decisions to end free movement of people, and this means clearly that the UK will lose the benefits of the single market. This is a legal reality. The EU does not want to punish, once again, it simply draws the logical consequence of the UK decisions to take back control. On financial services, UK voices suggest that Brexit does not mean Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Everywhere. They say there would be no changes in market access for UK established firms. They say joint UK-EU rules would be decided in a new symmetrical process between the EU and the UK and outside of the jurisdictions of the European Court of Justice. This would contradict the April European Council guidelines, which are my mandate, which stress the autonomy of the EU decision-making, the integrity of our legal order, and of the single market. The legal consequence of Brexit the legal consequence is that the UK financial service providers lose their EU passport. This passport allows them to offer their services to a market of 500 million consumers and 22 million businesses. But the EU will have the possibility to judge some UK rules as equivalent, based on a proportional and risk-based approach, and in those areas where EU legislation foresees equivalence. Ladies and gentlemen, the global financial crisis was not so long ago. It destroyed value and millions of jobs. It was a cause of social suffering, including in the UK. Let's not have a short memory. We will not compromise on financial stability. We will never compromise on financial stability in the EU and in the Eurozone. Never. Globally, we will continue our regulatory cooperation in the G20, in the Financial Stability Board, and perhaps even through bilateral regulatory dialogues like we have with the United States. We will remain committed to convergence of global rules and avoid fragmentation of financial markets. Once again, the integrity of the single market is not negotiable. The single market is one of our main public goods. It is the main reason why countries around the world, such as China, Japan, or the US, look to us as a strong partner. Ladies and gentlemen, but this is different from being part of the single market. And a good deal on our future relationship should facilitate this access as much as possible and avoid a situation where trade would happen under the WTO rules for goods and services. And to achieve this, there is a third key. We need to ensure a level playing field between us. This will not be easy. For the first time ever in trade talks, for the very first time for 60 years, the challenge will be maximize convergence. There will be no ambitious partnership without common ground in fair competition, state aid, tax dumping, food safety, social and environmental standards. It is not only about rules or laws. It is about societal choice for health, food standards, our environment, and the financial stability. The UK has chosen to leave the EU. We respect this choice. Does it want to stay close to the European model, or does it want to gradually move away from it? And the UK's reply to these questions will be very important and even decisive, because it will shape the discussion on our future relationship and shape also, be careful, on the condition for ratification of that partnership in many national parliaments and obviously in the European Parliament. And I don't say that to create problems. I just say that to avoid the problems. And to say clearly what are the conditions for the success of the process of ratification in the second stage of the negotiations about the future relations. Ladies and gentlemen, if we manage to negotiate an orderly withdrawal fully respect the integrity of the single market, and establish a level playing field, there is every reason for our future partnership to be ambitious. This is our preferred option. This is why we have started internal preparations with member states to be ready to talk about the future as soon as we will have agreed on how to settle the past. The EU will, of course, be ready to offer its most ambitious FTA approach. And the future partnership should not be limited to trade. It should be based on our common values. We need to work together to protect the security of our citizens, to combat crime and terrorism in Europe and globally. And logically, we will need to cooperate on foreign and defense challenges. But in none in these fields, the EU will wait for the UK. We must continue to advance. Negotiating new free trade agreements, in addition to the ones we already have with 60 countries. We will continue to develop our internal market and to make it fit for digitalization. We will step up our investment in research and innovation. We will continue to use the strengths of its internal market to shape globalizations. We will continue to show solidarity to refugees while better protecting our external borders and tackling root causes of migration, notably by continuing our development policy, in particular with Africa, where the EU and the UK will keep mutual interest. And we are developing our defense cooperation with unprecedented steps taken to set up a European Defence Fund and last week to finally launch the permanent structured cooperation on which I worked closely with Chris Patten when I was a commissioner in the Prodi Commission at the time, a very different time. Ladies and gentlemen, against the backdrop of global turmoil in an interconnected world, Europe is today more necessary than ever. The future of Europe is more important than Brexit. But in all these fields, the EU is willing to cooperate with the UK, and it will be in the UK interests also to have a strong EU as a close partner. Finally, I hope, Charles, that these ideas and these orientations, to be frank, will help the discussion that John Bruton, Monique Ebell, Peter Mandelson, and also Paul Adamson will have now on, if I make no mistake, squaring the Brexit circle in which I find myself. And I'm sorry to leave, but I have to go straight down to the Council now.
That's okay.
economic costs of a couple of different for the UK leaving the European Union, both for the UK, and at the end I'll say a little bit about the costs to some of the other member states. But before I get into that, I guess I want to make two key points that are going to form the basis for that economic assessment. And the first is that for the UK, services trade is more important to the UK economy than goods trade. And precisely what I mean by that is that in value-added terms, services trade makes up more than 50% of the UK's trade. Now that's quite unusual. That's an unusually heavy specialization on services trade, particularly financial and high value-added business and professional services. Now, at the same time, the single market, for all its imperfections, has been uniquely successful at generating increased trade and services, particularly in financial services. Now, when you put those two things together, you can already see that the picture is not going to be terribly rosy for the UK. Now, underlying a lot of this, my economic assessments, is some trade modeling, is some gravity modeling. And what we do there is we look at how much trade, how much do EU members trade with one another, how much more do they trade actually than you would expect based on geography. So we're already taking into account that you would be trading quite a lot with one another because we're close neighbors. Now, what we find is that for services particularly, the increases in trade are quite large. So EU members trade almost twice as much in services than pairs of non-EU members. That sounds like a very large number, but to put that into context, the UK's services exports have increased by about 150% since the late 90s. So what we're doing, that number attributes about 2/3 of that increase in services trade to the single market, right? At a time when indeed the single market was deepening and expanding in very significant ways, particularly for financial services. So in terms of goods, the single market has also been quite successful. There we see that the single market has increased trade among its members by about 70%. Now, in contrast, standard free trade agreements are much less effective at increasing trade. So, in fact, for services, this is quite extreme. When we compare countries, pairs of countries that have a services trade agreement to pairs of countries that have no trade agreement, we actually see no significant difference in the levels of services trade. Essentially, that means that the average free trade agreement in services is just not worth the paper it's written on. That's not to say there aren't counterexamples of good trade agreements that might be quite effective, but it's quite difficult to measure that. So, say the EU-Korea might be doing better than the average, but the average is really not impressive at all. In terms of goods, free trade agreements in goods are somewhat more successful, but still the impact of single market membership and the impact of having some sort of more standard, only focused on tariffs free trade agreement. So while single market membership increases trade among its members by about 70%, a standard free trade agreement does only about 1/3 as much of that, about 23, 24%. Now, that's mainly because the single market, as it has for services, has been very, very good at reducing non-tariff barriers. Okay? So, now, those are somewhat large, scary numbers. Now, what does that mean for the economic losses to the UK? Until now, I've talked about the gains from being in the single market. Now, when I want to turn that into an estimate of the economic costs to the UK, I have to do two things. First of all, I have to recognize that I've been talking about the impact of single market membership on the average EU country. Now, the UK is in many ways not the average EU country, and I think we can actually argue that probably because of its focus on financial services and business services, the UK has probably benefited more than average then, and that would then also indicate that it has more to lose by leaving. So the numbers I'm going to name to you are actually going to be probably, if anything, a little bit on the low side in that sense. But in another sense, I've been, again, talking about increases in trade from membership. We don't know very much about what happens when you throw that process into reverse. We don't know if then all of the gains of single market membership evaporate, or if some of them remain. So in that sense, we may be overestimating somewhat. So on the whole, if you look at the impact of the UK leaving, the impact on trade, we're set to lose about, if we leave both the single market and the customs union, we'll lose about 1/3 of our trade in total. That's quite a lot. We would expect that to be a pretty significant hit to the economy, and I'll be more precise in a moment. If we were to manage to stay in the customs union at least, we would be able to mitigate trade. There, I would expect then goods trade would decline by at most 15%, probably less. And of course, staying in the customs union would be very important for some of the UK's important manufacturing industries, in particularly automotive, where integrated supply chains really depend on being in the customs union. Now, how do all those big scary numbers on trade translate into GDP? Ahead of the referendum, we estimated that a Switzerland-type deal, which is not very different from being in the customs union, but not in the single market, would cost the EU in the long term between 2% and 7% of GDP. And there's a big bit of uncertainty around the impact of trade on productivity. So, as we all know, the UK's productivity performance has been particularly weak. Now, whether we're closer to 3% or 8% if we leave the single market and the customs union depends a lot on whether or by how much our rather poor productivity performance is made worse still by leaving. Now, in terms of the other member states who are also likely to be heavily affected, first on that list, I'm afraid, is Ireland. Our pre-referendum modelling indicated that the impact on Ireland could be almost as large as that on the UK. Now, that depends, that's neglecting one important factor, which is that Ireland might be in a position to pick up some of the financial and professional services business that the UK would no longer be able to do outside the single market and outside of the passporting regime. The other two countries that our modelling indicates would seem to be quite vulnerable are the Netherlands, although with the Netherlands there's always a bit of an issue around the Rotterdam effect, so we may be overestimating that somewhat. And finally, the other country that we expect to feel an impact if we leave would be Germany, mainly because of the integrated nature of the German automotive industry with UK supply chains. So, and indeed, that concern would extend to any country that plays a big role in particularly automotive and aerospace supply chains.
Thank you, Monique. I think towards the end, when you talked about the Swiss, you said EU, you meant the UK maybe, the impact on the UK
Yes.
GDP? Yeah, okay. Just in case anybody's tweeting out there, she meant UK, not EU. Right, over to you, John.
We in Ireland really don't have any objection to the decision that the UK took to leave the European Union, which was a decision taken by the market. This decision was not one that was properly debated in Britain. It's not one that, in my opinion, took into account the treaty obligations that the United Kingdom has with Ireland under the Good Friday Agreement, which was referred to extensively by Michel Barnier. It actually strikes me as quite remarkable that the Good Friday Agreement is being taken more seriously by French and German and Italian politicians than it is by British politicians, even though the Good Friday Agreement is an agreement to which the United Kingdom was a state party, and the interests of the European Union is only ancillary as far as that's concerned. It is quite remarkable in terms of the type of political decision-making and the narrow circle within which political decision-making is being made and was made 13 months ago in Britain to leave the customs union, leave the single market, that took no account, really, of the impact on Ireland. It is quite remarkable because, indeed, this is a decision of the Conservative Party, and the original model, if you like, for building a peace structure in Ireland is in the Sunningdale Agreement, which, as those of you will remember, was negotiated by a Conservative Prime Minister of the United Kingdom with his Irish counterpart, Liam Cosgrave. These decisions have major impacts for Ireland. 177,000 lorries cross the border in Ireland every month. There are 300 different roads that cross that border. 30,000 people cross the border every day to go to work, either in the Republic or in Northern Ireland. If customs controls have to be reintroduced, and whether they're introduced at the border physically or 10 miles back from the border on either side, these controls are going to involve substantial disruption of business, substantial additional costs. And the additional costs have been well illustrated to you by Monique in her presentation. She shows the difference between a single market and a trade agreement that involves customs controls, rules of origin controls, hygiene assurance, residue content assurance controls, all of which must be done physically on at least a sample of the goods under the Common Customs Code of the European Union. Ireland has been in a single market with the United Kingdom, and indeed Northern Ireland has been part of a single market probably since 1966, since before they joined the European Union, dating back to the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement of 1966. And in fact, we've been part of a political unity with Britain of a kind dating back to 1169. It is ironic that, in a way, it's Britain that now wants to break that up, but that seems to be the decision of the current UK government. I think it should not surprise anyone that the Irish government is regarding this as an existential issue. It should not surprise anybody that the Irish government has gone to great trouble to ensure that this issue is dealt with up front. Because if it is the case that in October 2016, when the UK decided needlessly to cast aside the option of customs union and single market, and didn't confront the issue then, that at least they'd be required to confront the consequences of what they are doing at this stage. And that's why the Irish government has taken the position it's taken. I would also like to add, however, that this is not an issue that is confined to the north-south dimension within Ireland. It has huge implications for Ireland's contact with the rest of the European Union. Physically, a non-member state is going to be a barrier culturally, economically, and politically, and geographically, between Ireland and the rest of the European Union. It costs twice as much to get goods from Ireland by sea direct to the continent of Europe than it does to get it through the land bridge, which is the UK. If we have to go through the land bridge to the UK, however, we face the prospect of 4 sets of customs controls on goods passing from Dublin into the island of Britain, out of the island of Britain, and then out of the island of Britain onto the continent of Europe. 4 separate sets of controls. I don't think that matter was considered very seriously by the UK when it made the decision. Now, you might say that the UK has to consider its own interests, and the UK has decided that this is in its own interests. But I think it's normal in interstate relations, short of wartime interstate relations, that countries take an intelligent interest in the predictable consequences of things that they do for their immediate neighbours. I think that's normal, civilized interstate behaviour. To my mind, that norm was not adhered to by the UK government in October 2016 when they decided to quit the single market and the customs union.
I must admit. Over to you, Peter.
Well, perhaps I can just give you my assessment of where things stand in Britain, or rather in the British government, and then make an observation, if I may, about Brussels' options. Needless to say, the 27 members of the EU have more options than the self-styled Lone Ranger, as the government is seeing Britain, sort of brave, blameless, and on the brink of leading the rest of the world. The Cabinet seemed to be moving in a more realistic direction in the summer, when it unanimously pronounced itself in favour of a transitional Brexit, a transitional period before a full Brexit. At least this recognised the complexities and the limitations of what can be achieved by March 2019. But the Cabinet are still no further forward in agreeing what we will be transitioning to, and now we are hearing the beginnings of a Brexiteers' backlash against the transition, as they point out that what David Davis said in Berlin last week contradicts what Mrs. May originally said in her Lancaster House speech and subsequently in Florence. So why are we in this jam 18 months after the referendum and 7 months after triggering Article 50? And I think to understand this, you have to realise what's going on inside the British Cabinet and the political fault line that runs through it. There's essentially a political standoff in the Cabinet between soft levers and clean breakers. And as a result, Mrs. May is unable, at this stage at any rate, to get agreement to the negotiating guidelines that she needs for any future trade deal. It's just as well, therefore, that the EU did not move to phase 2 in October. I'd say that even December is looking a little risky. Clean breakers, those like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, who prioritise sovereignty and control, do not want to negotiate. They don't want to do so because they don't want to be suckered into an arrangement based on EU laws and EU rules. For them, this is not what leaving is about. Soft levers, on the other hand, want Britain to continue to be aligned with the EU's economic structures because their priority is securing the continuity of trade in our largest export market.
They know negotiation is key to this, and they also know that it is a matter of rules for access, not money for access, that counts. So therein lies the divide, a pretty fundamental one: to negotiate or not to negotiate, to all intents and purposes. For appearance's sake, they repeat the mantra that Britain will seek the fullest possible future trade deal, by which they mean a bespoke arrangement tailored to the size of Britain's economy and our status as a former EU member. I have to say the information gap surrounding all this is huge. It is more like a chasm. Nonetheless, around half the cabinet are prepared to show the negotiating flexibility to achieve the best possible relationship to Europe's single market and its customs union. And I mean, they are prepared to show that flexibility. The rest might contemplate some sort of mutual recognition and cooperation arrangement in sectors where it suits Britain, but no more. They know the EU 27 are not going to offer such a hybrid deal, and they will claim that, governed inflexibly by its own rules, the EU is forcing Britain to walk away. They're prepared to pay the tab and to leave without a future trade deal, with reasonable commitments to EU citizens in all probability, but with no alternative to a hard border returning to Ireland, about which they don't seem to care a damn. So is it the case that as long as Britain rules out preemptively both single market and customs union options, we will almost certainly travel towards a damaging destination, which we will simply reach a bit later if we have a transition in place? Is it in the EU's interest to remain passive, or at least just reactive, towards Britain as time marches on? If the EU says these are the models, Norway, Swiss, Canadian, take one or leave them all, there is a very real risk that the UK will indeed leave them. Not because this is desirable, either for the UK or for the EU, but because it plays into the clean breakers' hands. They are not a majority in the cabinet, and certainly not in Parliament, but their opponents are cornered in the Conservative Party, and in Parliament their ranks are divided across 4 different parties. So let me ask a hypothetical question. Suppose, looking ahead, we are in a world where the UK has become a third country of the sort I used to negotiate with when I was Commissioner for External Trade. The UK would still be the 6th largest economy, for the time being at least, on Europe's doorstep, with an international financial centre that is bigger and more dynamic than anything else on the continent. Suppose the economic relationship is based on a modest free trade agreement that eliminates most tariffs, but not much else. This would reflect Europe's advantage in goods trade and Britain's need to retain foreign manufacturing investment. The regulatory systems of the EU and the UK are far from aligned in this future world, with UK policy trading off the implications for competitiveness of UK firms and what this means for access to the UK market and other markets around the world, a bit of a patchwork quilt. What would the EU want to do with the relationship in these circumstances? From my experience as Trade Commissioner, the EU would normally want to use its diplomatic and economic leverage to bind the UK into its economic and regulatory sphere of influence. In order to address the issue of regulatory alignment and cooperation between the UK and the EU could contemplate an agreement on the model of the EU-US TTIP. It would mean recognising that the UK is not the US and that the EU is the bigger partner by far. But it would recognise too that the UK is not a simple rule taker like Norway. TTIP illustrates a point that Canada is not the last word in trade agreements. A meeting halfway before TTIP was suspended was theoretically possible between two sophisticated and entrenched regulatory systems, which the EU may have been ready for with the US, given the size of the prize. Would they be prepared to do anything like this with the UK? Given the perhaps not, in which case the UK's market access will pay the price of divergence, and beyond that, in the middle of global regulatory competition, it will have to choose its side at some point. The Brexiteers obviously would clearly like to go in the American direction, and I suspect very happy for Britain to become a regulatory satellite of the United States. Even to have a conversation about this and of this nature is realistic now, given the current political stasis in Britain. The present cabinet barely know what a trade negotiation is, let alone why it is desirable. But who knows how long the Conservatives will remain in office. Nothing, and I mean nothing, is predictable in these circumstances. Brexit may even destroy Brexit with all its emerging contradictions, complexity, costs and divisions. So let me say this in conclusion. Because trade is important, the relationship of the UK to the EU cannot be dismissed. And the EU should approach this as it would any trade negotiation with a third country, albeit one which is a horribly difficult and dysfunctional negotiating partner, whose market is reasonably interesting in size and in close proximity. While the UK will never be an equal partner, it will certainly be the most important economic relationship for the EU on its doorstep by a large margin. Any free trade agreement may not offer the prize of trade liberalisation, given where we're starting from. We are moving backwards, whatever happens. But we should, in my view, seek to avoid, if we can, descent into a regulatory competition between the EU and Britain. And it would certainly head off the messy train wreck that currently now looks most likely. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And as we will say on these occasions, last but not least, Jean-Claude Piris. Jean-Claude.
Merci, Paul. For a naive lawyer like me, almost ignorant about sophisticated domestic British politics, this story is a succession of unbelievable decisions taken by the British government, which some are now turning towards Ireland and the rest of the 27 and the EU to try to save UK despite their will. The procedure of withdrawal from the UK is totally
decision of the state concerned. It decides alone on the principle of exiting. It decides alone on a date to convey its intention to the UK. Is it? That's it. Yeah, excuse me. I hope you have heard me about my ignorance of British politics. Okay, the country in question decides alone on the date to convey its intention to exit to the EU. And everybody knew, because it's written in the treaty, in Article 50, that these decisions triggers the procedure and starts the clock. And the clock is leading to withdrawal after 2 years, in principle. The UK decided alone to push the clock, to start the clock last March. Thus, one might have expected that the UK had already some answers to the main issues, as these issues were well all known before. It was in all writings on the subject. Unfortunately, and surprisingly enough, this was not the case. The EU then asked three, I think, quite reasonable questions, which were also listed beforehand in writings on Brexit. First, what are you going to do with our citizens? How are you going to protect their rights? Second, are you ready to calculate with us the amount of your debts, given that you participate in the adoption of EU spending decisions? And thirdly, and most importantly, what are your plans to respect the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, as Ireland obviously will stay in the EU's single market and custom union? As you know, the UK was apparently surprised by these three questions. It was not yet able to answer them, even now, and particularly the last one of Ireland, ignoring the obvious negative effects that will have, and we are 8 months after having unilaterally decided to start the clock. As to the future agreement on trade, a simple reading of the treaties, Article 216 to 218 of the functioning of the Union Treaty, showed that the negotiation of such an agreement could not even be launched before the exit, before the UK being a third country. Again, everybody knew that. It was written in the treaty. It was therefore obvious, even if the EU accepted informal exchanges during the period of 2 years, that an agreement could not obviously be ready to be implemented soon after the exit, but it will take some years. The UK denied that. That was really surprising, because it was written in treaties. Thus, it did not ask immediately for a transition period, which was a fundamental mistake. It should have asked that immediately. Now, I hear that Michel Barnier, he did not speak about that now, but I hear that he's talking about October to a decision on transition period. That would be a nightmare for economic operators. It's much too late. Now, despite the fact that the EU is insisting on the strict integrity and credibility of its internal market, and on the fact that you are either in or out, and that there is nothing else than the ocean between Norway and Canada, the UK is still asking to leave single market, to leave custom union, but that it deserves a bespoke agreement with half a membership of the single market. It also seems to think that trade agreements will be easy and successful with third states in the world. Décidément, la réalité dépasse la fiction. A naive lawyer cannot understand why a lose-lose situation for everybody, especially for the UK and Ireland, is thus becoming a possible scenario because of this succession of bizarre decisions. Let's hope that these illusions will finish before it's too late. The UK government has to prepare its public opinion to realities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Claude. Before I open this now to the audience, would anybody in the panel like to react?
Makes the decisions, the process. So could you assess the realism of a process by which enough autonomy was delegated to Northern Ireland to decide its regulatory and customs regime, and itself therefore decide which customs union and regulatory union to be part of after Brexit? So this is a special status option, but decided in Northern Ireland itself. And regardless of realism, what might be the outcome of such a process? And if I can add very briefly, it seemed to me that Peter Mandelson and Jean-Claude Piris took slightly different views on whether there is something. It'd be interesting to hear you clarify that. TTIP seemed to be a possible in-between option, which I understood Jean-Claude Piris to deny existed. So I'm probably wrong, but it'd be nice to hear a clarification of that.
Let's start with John. John, please.
Well, I think the first thing to say is what I've said already, is that the UK ought to have thought this out before it rejected the customs union and single market. It ought to have worked out how this issue of the border in Ireland and the effect on the Good Friday Agreement could be, the damage from that could be minimised. At this stage, the best solution is for Britain to change its mind and decide that it will stay in the customs union and in the single market. Now, people say that's politically impossible. I think that's letting the that something is politically impossible. We have the same situation at the moment in respect of Sinn Féin, who declined to take their seats in Parliament when they could make a huge difference to the shape of Brexit, and it said it's politically impossible for Sinn Féin to go back on this ancient idea of abstentionism. It's not. We're facing a major crisis affecting our two islands, and nothing should be considered to be politically impossible to be considered. So my first option is for Britain to reconsider its decisions, either with the present or a new government. As far as Northern Ireland remaining in the customs union and or the single market and the UK not doing so, I would have to say I would prefer to hear Jean-Claude Piris answering this question. My understanding is that the single market is a single legal order, have a single system for the making, the implementing, and the interpreting of common rules. And how that would be compatible with Northern Ireland for other purposes, having the Supreme Court in the UK as its ultimate decider, and for single market and customs union purposes, having the European Court of Justice as its ultimate decider. How those two can be reconciled is certainly above my pay grade as a lawyer. But I've no doubt it's well within the compass of Jean-Claude Piris.
First of all, Peter, then Jean-Claude.
Let me say something about Northern Ireland in a moment, because I do think it is extremely serious. Just in parenthesis, in response to Martin's question, is TTIP somewhere between Canada and Norway? Well, no, it isn't. In EU trade terms. I mean, Norway is in the EEA. It is in the single market. It accepts the rules, the legal basis, the single order of the single market, including the free movement of goods, services, people, and capital. Now, it was open to Britain to choose to go into the EEA after leaving the EU. We've rejected this, so we can't now have our cake and eat it. Jean-Claude is right about that. TTIP is a free trade agreement, or a would-be free trade agreement, or the model of TTIP is a free trade agreement which the EU sought. And it's therefore, in a sense, more than Canada, because it addresses directly the issue of services and the compatibility or the interaction of different regulatory standards and rules. And that's because I believe that services are such an important issue for Britain, and I don't just mean financial services, I mean a great deal of broadcast content and other services as well, I think it is desirable to look in the direction of that model if the EEA itself is ruled out. Now, on Northern Ireland, there is already pressure on the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland, and a return of a physical border would be very bad for Northern Ireland's stability and bad for the peace settlement embodied in the Good Friday Agreement. I believe that the return of a hard border would be exploited by hardliners on both sides, especially inside the Republican movement. It would be a big boost for the Republicans. Britain says it recognises the need for specific solutions for unique circumstances. I believe the job of the EU 27 is to keep Britain to that standard and to that goal. And that's why I think it should remain a priority for the EU 27 as we consider moving from phase 1 to phase 2 of the negotiation. It certainly cannot be put in the too difficult to solve pile. I mean, I have looked at this from every angle. I was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland when, following the agreement in 1998, which became stillborn for a year, I set about implementing it in 1999, and between then and 2001. My conclusion is that with Britain outside the single market and the customs union, the return of a hard border can only be prevented by Northern Ireland itself remaining inside or as close as possible to the single market and the customs union. I don't believe this would be a staging post to a united Ireland, as some unionists appear to fear. I think it's the best way to avoid provoking a movement to a united Ireland, and I'll tell you why. The Good Friday Agreement is based on a duality. Political separateness of Northern Ireland on the one hand, but within, on the other, an all-island economy. That was the duality. That was the basis, absolutely at the core and the heart of the Good Friday Agreement. If the economy is jeopardized by the reintroduction of that border, this, in my opinion, will start to make some middle-of-the-road people in Northern Ireland question the value of the political division of Ireland in the future. If you ask people to choose between their economic and their political interests and priorities, I think that opinion will certainly be polarized, but over time you are likely to see a drift towards putting economics before politics, and that would encourage support for a united Ireland. So for those who want to avoid that, they have to address this issue of the hard border. They have to find specific solutions to avoid this being reintroduced. I can't see another way other than Northern Ireland itself remaining inside the customs union, even if the rest of the UK does not. And I think this is the best way, as I say, to avoid what would otherwise be a huge provocation, a boost for the Republican movement, as I say, and would stop people having to make an invidious choice between their political views and their economic interests.
Thank you, Peter. Jean-Claude.
Yeah, I agree with Peter on one thing and I disagree with another thing. On Northern Ireland, I agree with him that the best solution is for Northern Ireland to be member of, to stay a member of the single market and of the custom union. I don't think custom union is enough. But I wonder if the pride of Albion will accept that.
In the professional qualifications, we actually would have very little idea of what we would be trying, which cherries we would want to pick.
Okay. As of now, Jonathan, you're next. I'm going to let's try and avoid all the questions being answered by the entire panel, if we can, please. Secondly, also, people in the front row have a kind of, in the front rows have an advantage because I can see them and they're more visible. So if you're toward the end of the room, it's really important you shake your hands. And then finally, I think you should ask, as of now, if you're asking a question, stand up. It's easier for people at the back of the room. It's nice for them to see you. So, already, wait a minute. I'll announce the people who are already on my list, because I actually know them. Jonathan Porteous, Charles Grant, John Kerr, Philip Souter, Simon Nixon, Graham Watson, and I think Michael Swan, was it? Yeah, my eyesight's very good. So we already have quite a long list. So try and address your questions to one or two members max of the panel. Jonathan, please, and if you wouldn't mind standing, Jonathan.
Jonathan Porteous from King's College London, addressed to whichever one feels best qualified, I guess. Just to pick up on John Bruton's point, I mean, suppose that we did do the supposedly politically impossible and decide we want to remain in the single market and customs union under this government or some alternative configuration. We then get, what would or should the response of the EU 27 be to that? It cannot simply be, well, okay, we offered you Norway or Canada, you've chosen Norway. Norway isn't in the customs union, and Norway, it isn't in the CAP, it's not the UK. There would have to be some new special status for the UK to enable that. What should that look like? What should the UK want? And what should the EU 27 offer?
John?
Given the scale of the UK economy relative to the EU being different to that of Norway, the consultative processes in regard to forthcoming legislation could be proportionately more intense between the EU. I think it is important to remember the interlaken principles which lay down that in any relationship that the EU has with a third country, the EU's decision-making autonomy, whether of its legislative process or of its courts, must be preserved. It cannot be subordinated to a third party.
Thank you, John. Charles Grant.
I want to be a bit of a devil's advocate on the Northern Ireland question. I'm very worried about this. I would have said a few weeks ago, based on conversations at this time, that a deal in December was likely, but it now seems, because of Ireland, a deal is not likely. While I happen to agree on the substance with what Peter Mandelson and John Bruton said, that's not how it'll look to many British people. There is a problem of perceptions. Firstly, to let the British government off the hook a little bit. A month ago, I was told by senior EU officials that we'll leave the Irish problem, the border, till the second phase of the talks, because you can't talk about the Irish border until you get onto customs. And that's for phase 2. So it's quite recently it's moved up the list, because Ireland, quite understandably, sees that now is the point where it has the most leverage to get something out of the British on this issue, because it can, if it wishes, veto the movement to phase 2. Everything that John says is absolutely right about how the British government has not thought this through enough. But the way it'll be perceived in Britain is this. It'll be perceived in Britain that the Irish government, backed by Sinn Féin, is using their leverage to promote the cause of United Ireland because the only way of solving the problem that John's described is for Northern Ireland to have a kind of economic union with the south of Ireland, to stay in a customs union, to stay in the single market. It's not enough for the customs union, it's the single market as well. So my worry is about the perceptions within the UK of this issue blowing up and the impact on British public opinion, including the impact on Remainer public opinion, who will see this is getting beyond the issue of Brexit to the issue of United Ireland. So this is my worry. And the customs union itself is not enough. There will, even if Britain stays in a customs union, which I think is conceivable, unless it stays in the single market, as Jean-Claude knows, you still need to have checks on the border to check for phytosanitary rules and so on.
Is that more a question or a comment? Judge, would you like a reaction? John, quickly, and then maybe any...
Surprised that you were taken by surprise about this. The UK signed the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. It's an international treaty. The UK has retained sovereignty of 6 counties of the 32 in Ireland ever since, with the consent of the people of Ireland in both parts. The UK knew its responsibilities from the beginning. The fact that everybody was consumed with the internal political dynamics of the Conservative Party and thought that because Mrs. May needed to say at her party conference in October something quite strongly nationalistic and said that she was leaving the Customs Union, the European Court of Justice and the Single Market to carry her conference, that was deemed by people like yourself to be sufficient explanation and sufficient excuse not to consider adequately the implications of this for Ireland. Is just not acceptable. Ireland may be a smaller country than England. It always has been and always will be. But you have a responsibility to consider the foreseeable effects of decisions that you take or that your Prime Minister takes on your behalf on your neighbours. There's no escaping from that. I'm not terribly worried, I must say, about the impact on British public opinion of the editorial in The Sun, which you more or less echoed in what you just said. I'm not worried about that because it may be necessary for English public opinion to go through a phase of anger